Hello friends. Tonight's story isn't about knights or kings. It isn't about glory. It's about the silence that came after the battles, the ache in men's chests that they dared not name. You've heard the stories of men with swords, men with calloused hands, men who never wept. But the truth beneath their armor was quieter, softer, and sometimes it bled in ways no wound could show. They told boys not to cry. They told men to be strong. But behind the armor and ale were secrets, some lonely, some violent, and some never meant to be known. So if the day has been long, let it go now. Turn down the lights. Let the noise of the world slip away. Because tonight, we're stepping behind the curtain of the medieval world, into the places men went when they were alone, into the quiet corners where even the strong collapsed, and into the spaces where grief was allowed to breathe, only when no one else was watching. Imagine a man waking before dawn. The cold stone beneath his feet is unrelenting, even through the thickest of wool socks. Outside, the frost has crept across every surface, clinging to the window's edge, sealing shut the barn door, crusting over the water bucket left out overnight. A rooster stirs, but does not yet call. Inside, the fire has long since died. The hearth is nothing more than a memory of warmth. There is work to do, as always. Cows to milk, tools to sharpen, and hunger to beat back. Not just his own, but his children's, his wife's, perhaps his aging father's too. He does not complain. That would be unbecoming. A man's burden in the medieval world was not to be spoken. It was to be carried, quietly, unfailingly. And when the load became too much, when it bent his back and hollowed his eyes, he simply tightened the grip and walked on. The world he lived in was one of constant, often invisible strain. War might not reach his village, but the fear of it always loomed. Illness too, not the dramatic sweep of plague, but the slow, wasting kind. A bad winter, a failed harvest, a sick child. Through it all, the expectation was simple: endure. It's easy now to think of medieval men as stoic by design, hardened by necessity. But endurance is not the same as peace, and silence is not the same as strength. In dusty corners of abbeys and monasteries, in the margins of parchment manuscripts, and beneath layers of wax, we find flickers of a different story. Men, ordinary, forgotten, unnamed, struggling beneath the surface. Some were scribes, monks, literate, introspective, and deeply burdened by what they witnessed. There are fragments, notes penned in Latin, squeezed into the corners of psalters and prayer books, descriptions of sleeplessness, of sorrow without name, of fears that God had forgotten them, that they had forgotten how to feel joy. Others were less educated, but they too found moments to break. At dusk, in the back of the church, in graveyards where no one watched, in the quiet of a barn after everyone had gone to bed. Men knelt in silence, cried without making a sound, clutched crude wooden crosses or stared into the ground, unwilling to meet even the eyes of saints. This was not weakness, it was survival, hidden in plain sight. The medieval world offered few spaces for men to fall apart, and when they did, they chose places the world had forgotten. The cold shadow of a chapel wall, the stillness of a cloister garden after Compline, the threshold of a door that no longer opened. They knew that grief could not be shown, but that didn't mean it vanished. It simply waited, buried, breathing, beneath the armor, behind the ale. In the cloistered silence of medieval monasteries, Where chants echoed off stone and time moved in prayer, sorrow was not absent. It was simply veiled. Imagine a monk in his cell. The walls are bare, save for a wooden cross and perhaps a scrap of parchment with a psalm or verse. Outside, the bells mark the hours with steady insistence. Inside, the silence is so complete that even a breath feels loud. For many men who took the cowl, it was not only faith that drew them in. It was escape from war, from debt, from unspoken things too heavy to bear. But peace was never guaranteed. The rule of St. Benedict, followed in many monasteries, encouraged restraint of speech, of appetite, of emotion. It warned against idleness and melancholy. And yet, in the confessionals, among the flicker of votive candles and the scent of beeswax, monks broke down. There are preserved brotherhood records, usually dry with lists of chores, penances, or prayer rotations, that occasionally betray something more human. A scribe notes, Brother Thomas wept in chapel again. Another, Brother Anselm speaks to himself in the garden. These aren't accusations, they're quiet acknowledgements, hints that even in a life devoted to God, peace was elusive. Confessions whispered through the screen were often not about sin, but sorrow. Some monks admitted to feeling numb, to going through the motions of worship without belief. Others described dreams of dead family members, of mistakes that could never be undone, of the terror that their solitude was not spiritual, but empty. There was a word for this, though it didn't mean exactly what it does today: melancholia. To the medieval mind, melancholia was not just sadness. It was a humoral imbalance, a black bile of the soul. It caused listlessness, despair, tears without cause. It afflicted poets, monks, thinkers, men who felt too much and spoke too little. Some saw it as a spiritual failing, others as a test from God. Either way, those who suffered were told to fast, to pray harder, to deny themselves further. Rarely were they told to speak, to cry, to feel. So men bore it in silence. There are letters, again, mostly hidden in religious archives, where one brother writes to another with tentative kindness. Your sorrow is known, one says. I too have felt the night grow longer. These moments are rare and precious because they show us that behind the discipline, behind the piety, there was quiet understanding. Not every man who wept in private was lost, but many were alone. And in a world that prized discipline over emotion, many of those men never spoke their sorrow aloud, not even to God. They simply lived with it, like cold beneath the robes, like wind through the chapel walls. Out beyond the monasteries, in villages and manors, grief took different shapes, but it wore the same silence. Picture a peasant man standing at the grave of a child. The earth is fresh. The wooden cross is plain. His hands are red with cold and effort, having dug the hole himself. No priest was available that day. Perhaps the village had no priest at all. He stands there, alone. His family waits by the hearth, but he lingers. He doesn't speak. There is no eulogy, only the sound of wind and birds too indifferent to mourn. This man might not have words for his pain. In his world, language for grief was shaped by religion. Lamentations for the soul, prayers for the departed. But the ache in his chest, the hollow that came each time he looked at that empty spot on the mat where his child once slept, that had no liturgy. There were no counselors, no support groups, no time. There was work to be done, and so grief, like so many other burdens, was folded into routine. He chopped wood, he repaired tools, he fed the animals, And at night, when the others slept, he sometimes stepped outside, just to breathe, just to stare into the dark, as if searching for something to make the weight shift. Some men turned to the church, others turned inward. Many blamed themselves, not because they were guilty, but because grief demands a reason, and when no reason comes, it turns on the grieving. We find evidence of this quiet despair in marginal places, in the scratched symbols on the walls of barns, a cross, a spiral, an animal drawn with trembling hand, in the unfinished carvings on a walking stick or a child's toy, in the folk songs passed down orally, barely remembered now, where a man sings to the moon about loss he cannot name. Even among the aristocracy, knights, landowners, stewards, grief was masked in ritual. There are records of men ordering masses for wives who had died in childbirth, year after year after year, long after the church would have required it, not from duty, but from need. Others kept small tokens, a bit of hair, a cloth, a brooch, hidden inside chests or sewn into the lining of a cloak, and still they did not speak. To name grief aloud was to risk unraveling. So men practiced a kind of quiet mourning, grief without tears, loss without ceremony, a pain shaped by silence and carried like a shadow, always present, never acknowledged. There were places a medieval man could go when the weight became too much. Not taverns. Those were too loud, too full of eyes and laughter. Not battlefields. Those were for killing, not for crumbling. No, when men broke, they sought the in-between places, the forgotten corners, graveyards after dusk, barn lofts long after chores were done, chapels with crumbling plaster where the saints' faces had faded and no one prayed any more. In these spaces, a man could lower his guard, not weep aloud, that would still be too much, but close his eyes, let his jaw slacken, let his breath stutter just for a moment, let the thoughts come. These quiet episodes weren't always dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting on a bench long after the bells had rung, or staring into a fire without seeing it, or whispering a name into the dark, even when no one could hear. There are medieval writings, sparse, fragile things, that hint at this. A priest journal mentions finding footprints in the snow behind the chapel at dawn. No reason for them, no footprints leaving, just one set, circling again and again. The priest writes, perhaps someone needed to be close to the dead. Another scribe in a coastal monastery describes a man who returned every week to the same stone at the edge of the cliff. He never spoke, just stood. Rain or wind, it didn't matter. Then he would leave. The scribe never asked why. He only wrote, grief has its own rituals. In some towns, men gathered informally, not to talk, not to confess, but simply to be in one another's presence. They carved spoons, repaired nets, sharpened scythes. Words were unnecessary. The act of doing was the act of enduring. But in the rarest of cases, some did write. Tucked in the back of monastic rulebooks or chronicles are margins filled with unexpected words. Personal ones. A monk in the 12th century, known only by his initials, wrote this in a margin. I have not spoken my sorrow because no one would believe it. And another, much later, simply wrote, Lord, if I weep, do not be angry. I have nowhere else to place this weight. These words, fragile as they are, show us a side of medieval manhood often overlooked. They were not always strong, not always stoic, not always silent. They simply had no room to show their sorrow in the open. so they folded it into prayer, into work, into the spaces where no one looked. And there, alone in the half-light, many of them broke, quietly, completely. And then, the next morning, they rose, as if nothing had happened. The medieval peasant man, so often imagined as grim, stooped, endlessly toiling, was, like all people, more complicated than his labor. Yes, his days were long. Yes, his world was shaped by survival, harvests and hunger, taxes and tithes. But when the sun set and the work was done, another life stirred beneath the dirt and ash. There were pleasures, many of them small, some strange, and some that had to be hidden from the eyes of church, lord and wife alike. Because pleasure, for the medieval man, was not innocent. It was watched, regulated, condemned. The church had opinions on everything: what you could eat, when you could laugh, even which thoughts you were allowed to think when alone. And yet, behind hedges and beneath thatched roofs, men indulged. Not in great roaring celebrations, those were rare, but in private rituals, secret treats, odd habits passed from father to son, or whispered over mugs in the far corner of a tavern. One such ritual involved the making of warming wine. It wasn't wine in the way we understand it, more a concoction: boiled berries, stale ale, a pinch of powdered root or dried animal part, supposedly to heat the blood, to stir a man's vitality, as they might have put it. Some used wild garlic, others a bit of boar's tooth ground into powder. One 14th century herbal recommends the tongue of a crow, dried under moonlight, though even in its day that advice was considered eccentric. These were more than just folk remedies. They were indulgences, homemade aphrodisiacs, crafted not for healing, but for excitement. And they worked, not always pharmacologically, but psychologically. A man believed he had drunk something powerful. That belief was half the magic. He didn't share this brew with his wife, nor with his priest. It was a private thing, an inheritance from older men who had likewise whispered of ways to wake the fire. Alongside these rituals came places, hidden places, barns converted briefly into gambling dens. Not the glittering halls of cards and coin we think of today, but dim, straw-littered rooms where dice clattered and copper changed hands. The stakes weren't high, but the thrill was. It was illegal, of course. The church condemned gambling as a sin of chance and distraction. Lords hated it for its subversion. Serfs exchanging wealth, however small, without their oversight. But men gathered anyway, usually in the dead of night, when the moon was high and the fields were still. They bet on dice, sure, but also on strange contests. Who could drink the fastest? Who could spit the farthest? Who could balance a sack of grain on one foot the longest? There was laughter, harsh, hushed, barely suppressed. And there was something else, relief. Not joy exactly, but the brief lifting of the weight, the kind of pleasure that had to be stolen, and always, always returned before dawn. Because in the morning, the yoke came back down, the fields called, the priest preached, and the men, as always, obeyed. But for a few hours, in shadow and smoke, they remembered how it felt to be something other than obedient. Imagine a wooden structure at the edge of a village. Its roof is low. Its beams are warped with age. Smoke drifts faintly from a hole in the ceiling, and the smell that clings to the walls is strange. Part steam, part sweat, part something faintly herbal, almost spicy. This is the bathhouse, not the grand tiled thermae of ancient Rome. but a rough, rural echo of it, small, dark, and entirely local. The bathhouse was meant to be practical, a place to wash, to scrape off the mud and toil of labour. Water was heated over open fires, poured into basins, sometimes mixed with sage, mint, or rosemary, if the season allowed. But for peasant men, especially in the later medieval period, the bathhouse became more than just a site of cleanliness. It became a space of forbidden relaxation. Here, among steam and murmured voices, the rules blurred. Modesty faded. The priest did not come here. Wives stayed home. Children were asleep. The flickering firelight and damp air created a kind of separate world, a temporary freedom. Some men simply soaked and sighed, their muscles easing for the first time in weeks. Others whispered. They whispered about their dreams, their frustrations, their hungers. And some of those hungers were not culinary. There are scattered records, usually from disapproving churchmen, of immoral conduct in such bathhouses. The language is vague, often coded. Acts of impurity, unchaste behavior, sinful closeness. But between the lines, we see something human. Touch, curiosity, longing. Not always acted upon, not always understood, but present. Because in this steamy, flickering place, the boundaries of medieval male life, obedience, restraint, silence, were temporarily softened, and so too were the men. There were rituals here as well. A man might rub his skin with ash before entering to draw out the humours. He might pour cold water over his head and mutter a charm. Not a Christian prayer, but something older. A rhyme passed from grandfather to grandson. In some bathhouses, older men sat quietly in corners, eyes closed, seeming to remember things they never spoke aloud. Youths exchanged glances. The fire crackled. Someone coughed. And then it passed. The water cooled. The fire dimmed. The men dressed and returned to the world, to their wives, to their fields, to the rules. The next morning, nothing was said, but the warmth lingered, in muscle, in memory. And somewhere deep within, so too did the sense that for just a little while, they had escaped. In the medieval world, desire was dangerous, not just in deed, but in thought. The church taught that even longing was sinful, that the flicker of a wayward thought could stain the soul like soot on linen, and men, being men, often found themselves stained. There was, however, a place to pour out those thoughts. The confessional. It was not always the wooden booth we picture today. In earlier centuries, it might be a simple corner of the church, screened by cloth, or even a quiet bench outside, beneath a tree, where a priest sat in expectation. And here peasant men came, not just to confess what they had done, but what they had wanted. The tone was often hesitant. Father, I dreamed of her again. Father, I watched her carry water, and I could not look away. Father, I am married, but I think of another. The priest, if he was kind, listened with detachment. If he was not, there were stern words, penances, days of fasting, recited prayers until the mouth went dry. But the men still came, because even in shame, there was relief in being heard. These were not predators, not monsters. These were ordinary men, burdened by natural feelings in an age that called those feelings unnatural. There are old ecclesiastical manuals, guides for priests on how to question penitents. They list questions that seem startling in their specificity. Has the penitent thought of his neighbor's wife while laying with his own? Has he touched himself in idleness with intent? Has he gazed upon a maiden while she bent in work and failed to turn his eyes away? The assumption was not that such thoughts might happen, but that they would. And behind those questions, we glimpse the truth. Peasant men struggled with desire as all men do. But their world offered no space to understand it, only to suppress it, to confess it, and then to pretend it had passed. Some men did more than whisper to priests. They whispered to saints. In rural churches, there were statues of St. George, St. Sebastian, or even the Virgin Mary, worn smooth by hands. Not just hands of prayer, but of private pleading. Help me stop this feeling. Take this from me. Forgive what I cannot name. And occasionally, when the church was empty, a man might kneel not before the altar, but at the feet of a saint he had chosen for himself. One who seemed to understand, one who, carved in wood or stone, looked down not with judgment, but silence. This was his sanctuary, not for healing, not for absolution, but for being seen, just for a moment. Then the door creaked open, someone entered, the moment ended, and he stood up, as if nothing had happened. Among the more obscure corners of medieval records lie entries that are difficult to interpret. They come mostly from bishops' ledgers, inquisitorial notes, or fragments of court cases. Brief, uneasy lines about strange acts performed by men in private, or whispered accounts overheard in taverns and kitchens. Acts not quite criminal, not quite sacred, but somewhere between the two. Ritual, sexual, superstitious. One recurring theme is the so-called self-cleansing rites. Before marriage, some peasant men were believed to undergo secret purifications. These weren't the formal rituals of the church. No incense, no Latin chant. Instead, they were deeply personal, passed from older men to younger in secret. And they involved the body in ways that mingled fear, desire, and superstition. In one 13th century account from rural Normandy, a man admitted to bathing at midnight in a stream, naked and alone, while chanting an old rhyme meant to burn off desire. He'd been told by his uncle that unless he did this, his marriage bed would be cursed, that his wife would be barren, that their union would bring shame. The rhyme was not Christian. It invoked no saints. Instead, it spoke of clearing the fire beneath the skin. Another man, in a different account, confessed during a church inquiry to using a mixture of herbs and animal blood, not to arouse, but to suppress. He believed, as some in his village did, that a man must arrive at marriage emptied of all prior fire. These rituals weren't universal, but they point to a truth. Medieval men were not passive in their desire. They feared it, fought it, sometimes gave into it, but more often they sought to control it, in ways that had nothing to do with official doctrine. There were also rumors of group rituals, secretive gatherings held in barns or glades. Not orgies, as the church sometimes feared, but symbolic acts of bonding and testing. Men stripping to the waist, washing one another with cold water, taking oaths. The church, of course, denounced all of this. Any gathering of men without religious sanction was suspect. But the rituals endured, quietly, because they weren't really about magic, or even sex. They were about fear, fear of being judged, of being found wanting, of not measuring up to what a man was supposed to be. So they created their own rites, their own purifications. And when they returned home, to the marriage bed, to the work, to the role they were expected to play, they were changed, not necessarily cleansed, but at least prepared. In a world where sin was everywhere, in thought, in glance, in appetite, many peasant men developed quiet strategies for managing their urges, not to eliminate them, but to keep them just far enough from damnation. One such method involved pilgrimage. Now officially, pilgrimage was a sacred act, a journey to a holy site, undertaken for penance, healing, or thanksgiving. But for some men, especially those with no deep piety, it served another purpose. It was an excuse to leave, to step outside the village, the marriage, the watchful eye of the priest. Men walked to shrines, not always to pray, but to breathe, to see other faces, to feel the anonymity of travel, to indulge carefully in temptations far from home. Taverns along pilgrimage routes were known for more than ale. Some doubled as brothels, quietly tolerated by towns whose economies depended on the pilgrim trade. And while the church disapproved, it often turned a blind eye. A man who sinned on the road might still return with a relic, a badge, a tale of hardship overcome. The sin could be confessed, washed clean, forgotten. It was, in a way, a sanctioned lapse. But others didn't go so far. Some men took refuge in a subtler act, watching, not with malice or aggression, but with hunger. There are accounts of men lingering near wells or washing sites, quietly, from a distance. They didn't speak, didn't approach. They simply watched, and then walked away. The church considered this sinful too. A lustful gaze was almost as damning as the act itself. But for the men, it was a compromise, a way to feel something, to remind themselves they were alive. Then there were the songs, peasant songs, bawdy, strange, half-remembered, passed from mouth to mouth. Many were about food and animals, but beneath the surface, double meanings bloomed. A plump goose became something else. A baker's oven, something more. Singing such songs in the field, or while sharing ale, allowed men to speak desires they could not name directly. It was humor, camouflage, confession without risk. And for those moments, as the laughter rose and the sun dipped low, the tension eased. Just a little, just enough, to return home and play the part once more. The dutiful son, the quiet husband, the good man, even if he wasn't always certain what that meant. To understand the secret pleasures of medieval peasant men, we have to understand what was forbidden and why. The medieval church's teachings were not just moral, they were anatomical. Bodies were seen as sites of weakness, of temptation. The flesh, especially male flesh, was believed to be constantly on the verge of betrayal. There was a reason monks wore heavy robes, why windows in bathhouses were shuttered, why sermons dwelled on sin far more than on love. The body was to be ignored, hidden, controlled. And yet, men had bodies, and they noticed each other's. We don't know how common it was, or how open, but we do have traces, dim, nervous, partial, of male intimacy. Not in the way we speak of it today, not proudly, but quietly, shamefully, and still, tenderly. In one monastery record from the early 14th century, a prior notes that 2 young novices spent too much time in the garden alone. Their names are recorded only once. After that, one is transferred. The other disappears from the rolls entirely. No trial, no punishment, just removal. Another account from rural Poland tells of a traveling stonecutter who shared a barn with a shepherd for several winters. Years later, when the shepherd died, the stonecutter paid for his burial and requested to be laid beside him. The church agreed, but the record, hastily scribbled, adds one final note. Brothers, though not in blood. Were they lovers, friends, something in between? It doesn't matter. What matters is that someone cared enough to be remembered beside the other. And in a world where male emotion was so often hidden, such acts speak loudly. Other men left quieter clues. In the margins of books, initials carved next to one another. A poem where one man praises the eyes of his dearest companion. A prayer that asks God to watch over him, whose company brings peace. It wasn't always physical, but it was intimate, and it was forbidden. The church's fear of male closeness was not just about sex. It was about control. When men bonded deeply, outside marriage, outside authority, they created loyalty that didn't serve the system. So the system pushed back, with rules, with suspicion, with silence. And still, the men found each other. Sometimes through work, sometimes through music, sometimes through nothing more than a glance across a firelit room. And sometimes, rarely, they left behind a mark. Not enough for history to build their monuments, but enough for us to know. They were there. While the church kept tight reins on bodily pleasure and desire, it couldn't erase one ancient indulgence: feasting. Even among the poorest, there were moments, rare, scattered, fleeting, when food was abundant and laughter less guarded. Harvest festivals, saints' days, or a neighbor's wedding gave occasion for the rules to loosen. Imagine a man sitting at a rough-hewn table under the fading light of autumn. Before him, thick bread, roasted turnips, a dish of lentils, perhaps even a joint of meat, salted or fresh if they were lucky, honeyed beer in a chipped cup, a wedge of sharp cheese, crumbling slightly in the fingers. It was not extravagant, but it was more than daily fare. And for a few hours the air shifted. There were games, insults traded with warmth, music, crude flutes, hand drums, a voice singing something both funny and a little obscene. This was not the holy joy preached from pulpits. It was earthier, built from closeness, from shared hardship, from letting go. The church, predictably, distrusted these gatherings. They feared excess, drunkenness, lewdness, and yet men needed it. Not just the food, but the moment when masks could slip. Some even played roles. During festivals like the Feast of Fools, peasant men might dress as clergy in parody, chanting fake sermons, pretending to absolve one another of ridiculous sins. It was satire, yes, but also a release valve, a way to laugh at power without challenging it directly. Older men watched the young with knowing smiles. Youths dared one another to perform ever more foolish feats. Someone inevitably fell into the fire pit or passed out under a table. But underneath the laughter was something deeper: affection. Men who never spoke their feelings in daylight might slap each other's backs, press a hand to a shoulder for a moment too long. They might sing together, loudly, off-key, grinning, their voices blending into something warmer than words. And when the food was gone and the fire low, they went home, back to silence, but with something softened inside. These small joys, foolish, fleeting, frowned upon, mattered, because in a life ruled by obedience and toil, such moments reminded men that they were more than laborers, more than husbands, more than penitents. They were human, hungry, foolish, aching for warmth. And sometimes, just sometimes, they found it. As much as peasant men gathered for gambling, feasting, and confession, many of their truest pleasures came in solitude. Those stolen fragments of time when no one else was looking. Night, especially, held a certain freedom. Once the tools were hung, the fire banked, the children asleep, and the wife breathing softly beside him, a man might step outside, just for a moment. The stars overhead, clear and cold, offered no comfort, but they also asked for nothing. Here, under sky instead of ceiling, a man might breathe deeply for the first time all day. He might light a pipe, if he had one, or run his hands through frost-stiff grass, or simply sit, doing nothing, saying nothing. And in that silence, a pleasure emerged, not one of flesh, but of stillness. He belonged to no one in that moment, not to his Lord, not to the church, not even to the expectations of family, just himself. This too was a kind of rebellion. A quiet, private joy that no sermon could scold, no tithe could touch. In some cases, men extended this solitude into small rituals. They carved, not for trade, not for use, but for the pleasure of shaping something with their hands, a spoon, a whistle, a bird from a block of wood. These objects were often crude, discarded, or hidden, but they were meaningful. A man might keep his carving in his cloak pocket, run his thumb over its edges while walking the fields, not because it served a purpose, but because he had made it for no one else. Others composed rhymes, little songs that never left their mouths. They whispered them to themselves while tending sheep or walking home. A verse about the moon, a line about a lost love, a joke only they would ever hear. In these small acts, they reclaimed something. Their time, their minds, their inner lives. Because while the church preached submission and their lords demanded labor, these quiet men held onto slivers of themselves, hidden in songs, in carvings, in stars. It was not freedom, not really, but it was something close. And in a world where every other pleasure had to be justified or confessed, perhaps this secret, this simple moment alone under the night sky, was the purest indulgence of all. As we leave this shadowy world of secret indulgences, it's tempting to view these men through a modern lens, to cringe at their rituals, to scoff at their beliefs, to judge their silence and shame. But that would miss the point. These pleasures, however odd, however taboo, were shaped by their time. A time when sin was everywhere and redemption was expensive, when your desires could damn you and your joy had to hide behind hedgerows and barn doors, when being seen, truly seen, was both dangerous and rare. Yes, there were moments that might make us uncomfortable. Men drinking concoctions of bone and wine, convinced they stirred manhood. Men peeking at washing women from behind trees, telling themselves it was harmless. Men confessing urges in hushed, panicked tones, not knowing if they would be forgiven. But there were also moments of tenderness, of yearning, of confusion, not cruelty. These were not evil men, not predators or saints, just people, trapped in a world that gave them so little space to feel. And so they carved out what space they could, in dark corners, in whispered songs, in foolish laughter shared between sips of mead, in a glance held too long, in a touch too tender, in a carving hidden in a cloak. And maybe that's what makes this history so quietly human. Not that these men were virtuous or depraved, but that they were trying to feel something real in a world that kept insisting they shouldn't, trying to hold on to joy, even when it came with risk, trying to remember who they were when no one else was watching. Their pleasures were not polished, not safe, not always kind, but they were theirs. And in remembering them, we let them live again, not as symbols, but as souls. In the heart of a cold stone chapel, a man kneels, not in prayer, but in preparation. His robe is folded beside him. His back is bare. His breath clouds in the frigid air. In his hand, a whip. Leather thongs, sometimes tipped with metal or bone. He raises it. He strikes. The sound is quiet, not a cry, not a shout, just the soft, wet thump of pain meeting flesh. This was not punishment, not in the way we think of it. This was self-flagellation, an act of penance, of devotion, of desperation. And for some men in the medieval world, it was the only way they knew to speak their suffering. The flagellants, as they came to be known, were not one group, but many. Some were monks, others were peasants. Some joined loosely organized bands that walked from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a warning and a plea. But most did it in private, behind monastery walls, in barns, in woods just past the edge of the village. They said it was for sin, to purge the body, to remind the soul of its place. But behind the piety, something else stirred. For some, the pain became a language, a substitute for the words they couldn't find, a release valve for guilt, grief, rage, emotions that had no other acceptable outlet in their world. There are records of men flagellating themselves nightly during times of plague. Others did so after the death of a child, or when the harvest failed, or simply when the world became too heavy. They did not scream. They were not supposed to. Pain, like sin, was meant to be endured in silence. And yet, even the church grew wary. By the late 13th century, bishops began to speak against the practice, not because it was sinful, but because it was too raw, too uncontrolled, too honest. Men who whipped themselves to blood were hard to command. Their suffering answered to no priest. And still, they continued. Some flagellants died from infection. Others wore their scars like badges, proof that they had atoned, or at least that they had tried. But most healed. The wounds closed, but the reasons that opened them remained hidden, unspoken, pressed down like ashes beneath stone. Because in a world where strength meant silence, the only safe place to break was in secret, and sometimes with blood. Violence in the medieval world was not always sanctioned by battlefield or banner. Sometimes it happened in shadow, in fields, behind taverns, beneath the wide eaves of a barn, where fists flew not for glory, but for grief, for shame, for something that had no name but needed release. Imagine two brothers. They work the same land, sleep under the same roof, share the same fears of hunger, of plague, of debt. But one day, a tool goes missing, or a sheep dies, or maybe nothing happens at all. They argue, and then they fight, not with swords or strategy, but with fists, elbows, knees, with the rough, desperate rhythm of men who've kept too much inside. The church called it disorder, the law called it a fray, but to the men themselves, it was necessary, because medieval manhood offered few outlets for pain that wasn't righteous or blessed. You could grieve in prayer, yes, but what about anger? What about the bitterness that builds after years of silence and sacrifice? What about the shame of failure, of not protecting your family, not meeting the tithe, not living up to the image of the good man? Sometimes there was no prayer for that, only a punch. Witnesses, when there were any, rarely intervened. They knew better. Let them fight, the villagers might say. Let them bleed a little. Better than what comes if it stays locked inside. And then, just as suddenly, it would end. A bloody nose, a split lip, a silence heavier than the bruises. They might not speak for a while, might avoid one another at the well or in the fields, but over time the wound closed. Because the fight had done what it needed to do. It didn't fix anything, but it emptied the cup, at least for a while. These weren't grand duels. They weren't measured with honor or law. They were raw, ugly, human, and often forgotten by everyone but the men themselves. Some chroniclers, centuries later, would speak of a brotherhood of bruises, men bound not by affection, but by having seen one another break. And in a world that rarely forgave male vulnerability, that was perhaps the closest many came to intimacy. Two men, two black eyes, and a silence that understood. There were duels in the medieval world that made it into the songs. Formal challenges, spectators, swords gleaming in morning light. But those stories, like most things remembered, came from the world of nobles, where violence was wrapped in ritual and rules. For the peasant man, for the forgotten tradesman, for the soldier without rank, violence wasn't ceremonial, it was personal. And the duels they fought, no audience, no witnesses, no heralds, just two men in the woods, or by the edge of a field, or in the shadow of a crumbling wall. These were not contests of bravery. They were often born from shame, from envy, from a silence that had festered too long and turned to poison. A man might feel wronged by a neighbor who spread rumors, by a fellow farmhand who got too close to his wife, by a cousin who laughed at the wrong moment. And one day, when no one else was around, the confrontation would come. A blade was not always drawn. Sometimes it was fists, a stone, a length of iron from the blacksmith's pile. The rules were simple. There were none. Because honor was a currency peasants rarely had the luxury to spend. These fights didn't go down in history. They were buried with the bruises, unless someone died. Then the church took notice. Then the village gossiped. But even then, the story was told carefully, not as a murder, but as a tragedy. He was troubled. He drank too much. They had never gotten along. The words veiled the truth, that two men had reached the end of their rope, and one hadn't come back. Sometimes the survivor confessed. Sometimes he ran. More often, he simply carried the weight. Not guilt, at least, not always, but something heavier. The knowledge that there had been no justice in the fight, no righteousness, just need, just rage. These secret duels were not about courage. They were about control, about taking back a sliver of power in a life where every other choice belonged to someone else. And in the silence that followed, the body buried, the story whispered, the blood washed from stone, the man returned to his chores, his role, his mask. But deep within him, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and the path back wasn't always clear. There were places men went when they needed to disappear for a while. Not to die, just to break. A barn, long after the animals had been fed. A grove of trees past the last plot of land. A hillside with no name, where no one planted or prayed. These were not destinations, they were retreats. Spaces where no one would follow, because something was wrong inside, and the man knew it had to come out, but not through words, through pain, not inflicted by others, but by his own hand. The church had names for such acts: temptation by devils, attacks of melancholy, moments of weakness. They didn't quite understand it. They didn't want to, but the men did. They knew what it felt like to want the pain to stop and not know how. So they turned to what they could control. A thorn pressed into skin, a fingernail drawn hard across the forearm, a knuckle slammed again and again into the frame of a stall. Quiet violence, personal, contained. It wasn't about death. It was about sensation, about replacing the gnawing inside with something sharp, tangible, immediate. Records rarely mention these things directly, but here and there, hints appear. A monk writes, "Brother Odo was found behind the stables, his hands bloodied. He said he had fallen, but there were no stones." A wife confesses, "He comes back from the woods with tears and mud on his face. He says he is praying." In some cases, the behavior was blamed on devils. Not metaphorically, literally. "The evil one rides him," one priest writes, "makes him claw at the walls, strike his own head." But not all believe that. Some midwives, women more practical than priests, whispered another truth. "He's not possessed," one said. "He's grieving." There was no word for depression, no vocabulary for trauma, only symptoms. And in barns, in forests, in silence, men bled them out, quietly, secretly, hoping the pain would purge the pain. They would return home hollow-eyed, say little, eat quietly. No one asked, because no one wanted to know. And maybe they didn't either. There were wounds in the medieval world that didn't show on the skin. Shame was one of them. It clung like smoke, seeped into the bones. And for many men, it became a private punishment, constant, consuming, and inescapable. Shame for a failed harvest, for a child that didn't survive, for a marriage grown cold, for feelings that had no place in church or home. A man might smile, nod at the market, say his prayers, but inside he was coiled, tight with things he could not name. There was no language for emotional failure, only moral failure. You had sinned, or been tempted, or grown weak. The solution was always the same: pray harder, work harder, confess. But what if the shame wasn't about sin? What if it was about helplessness? That no one wanted to hear. And so the shame turned inward. Some men grew rigid, hyper-obedient, devout in a way that made others nervous. They fasted excessively, whipped themselves even when no one was watching, spoke of hell more than heaven. Others grew withdrawn. They answered only when spoken to, ate without tasting, avoided touch, even from family. They feared their own reflection. In a 15th century clerical letter from Yorkshire, a priest wrote, "One man in our parish will no longer enter the church. He stands outside watching the door and turns away." No reason was given, no sin confessed, but the shame was visible, to others and to him. There are darker hints too. In manorial records, we find fines for men who struck themselves in public or refused food given by the parish. In monasteries, reports of novices harming themselves during vigil, always couched in formal terms, never explained, because no one wanted to talk about the real cause. Shame eats quietly. It doesn't cry out. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't confess. It waits. And for the men who carried it, the burden was often lifelong, not because they deserved it, but because they had no way to let it go. No one told them it was okay to grieve, to fail, to feel. They were told to endure, and so they did. Until slowly, something inside them went silent. Pain, in the medieval world, did not always stay with the man who felt it. It passed down, quietly, invisibly, like a shadow that lengthened across generations. A father who worked until his joints gave way, who never spoke more than a few words at the table, who never struck his son, but also never smiled at him. A son who learned early not to ask questions, not to cry, not to need. This was how violence traveled. Not always in blows, but in absence, in expectations left unspoken, and love left unsaid. There are no records for this, no chronicles of quiet houses, of eyes turned away, of a hand raised but never followed through. And yet, the silence is everywhere. Some men tried to break the pattern. We see hints in the way they wrote letters to sons who had moved away, in the way they left small tokens behind after death, a carved knife, a wooden box, a single line in a will, to Thomas, who was always gentle. But others, they simply passed it on, because it was all they knew. They had learned that to feel was weakness, that to comfort was indulgence, that to speak tenderly was foolish, and so they hardened, and so their children did too, until perhaps one generation whispered a joke instead of scolding, or paused just a second longer before walking away from a crying boy, or did not raise their voice. Small things, but perhaps, in that world, radical. Because the violence that men turned inward often turned outward in the quietest of ways, not in blows, but in absence. A glance not returned, a question not answered, a life passed in proximity, but never truly in connection. And the tragedy, many of them didn't want it to be that way. They simply didn't know how else to be. They had inherited silence, and sometimes they left it behind, unspoken, as their only gift. There were some men in the medieval world who simply disappeared, not always physically, not always into the woods or the river or the plague pits, but inward. They were present, they did the work, they answered when called. But something inside had gone quiet, not out of peace, but exhaustion. These were men who no longer hoped, not in God or luck or love. They didn't ask for more, didn't dream of better, didn't resist. They simply endured. There's a phrase that appears in a handful of monastic records: withdrawn from the world, though still among us. It described not hermits, not monks, but lay brothers, servants, stewards, men who ceased to engage, who moved through the halls like ghosts. One monk wrote of a man who tended the garden for 20 years and never once smiled. He was not cruel. He was not mad. He just was. In parish records, they were harder to spot. A man who never remarried after his wife died, who kept his son's shoes even after he'd long outgrown them, who still walked the same path to a field he no longer owned. Neighbors pitied them, or feared them, or most often ignored them, because to look too closely was to recognize something familiar. The line was thin between the man who laughed with you at the tavern and the man who one day sat by the river and did not return. These vanishings were rarely spoken of. If a body was found, it was buried. If it wasn't, prayers were said. Life went on. But in the unspoken corners of village memory, people remembered. He was gentle. He was strange but good. He just had too much sorrow. And in the quiet places, by old wells, under certain trees, some said you could still feel them. Not ghosts, not spirits, just traces, of men who bore more than they could name, of men who turned violence inward, until finally they faded. History does not often preserve whispers. It saves declarations, battles, edicts, coronations. But what about the moments between two men, sitting too close by a fire, or the letters folded so tightly their creases outlived the ink? What about the feelings that had no name but left traces anyway? In a monastery archive in northern France, there is a letter, unsigned, undated, found tucked inside the binding of a psalter. It reads, in Latin, "When I saw you last, the frost was on the windows, and yet I felt no cold. Your words have stayed with me. I pray you are safe. I do not know if I will see you again, but if not, know that I felt something, and it was not wrong." The letter was not addressed to a woman, and it was never sent. Scholars debate. Some say it was spiritual, a monk writing to his confessor. Others say it was romantic. But the truth is, we'll never know. And maybe that's what makes it so haunting. It wasn't supposed to be found, just as so many of these bonds were never supposed to be recorded. But some were. In margins, in burial records, in quiet disciplinary notes where the language trembles with discomfort. One friar writes, "Brother Paul and Brother C are too often alone. They smile at each other as lovers do. I fear for their souls." Another record simply states, "They were separated. No punishment, no trial, just distance, because that was safer." And yet, there were moments that even separation couldn't erase. Letters written but never delivered. Graves requested side by side. Songs, anonymous, half erased, where a male voice sings of a friend who left and a heart that would not mend. We don't know how many of these stories existed, but they did. Not in the pages of kings, but in the cracks between the words. In the medieval world, there were many names for male closeness. Companion, brother-in-arms, comrade, fellow pilgrim. None of them were romantic, none of them were forbidden. And yet, sometimes, they shaded into something else. In military orders, such as the Knights Templar or the Teutonic Knights, men lived, ate, prayed, and bled side by side. They formed bonds deeper than family. In some cases, they died in one another's arms. What we might now call intimacy, they called duty. But read closely, and you begin to see what they could not say aloud. One knight, writing in his journal after a siege, described his fallen companion as the other half of my soul. Another requested to be buried with a small lock of his comrade's hair. Even in monastic communities, where brotherhood was the norm, some pairs stood out. Two monks assigned to different tasks insisted on working side by side. They shared meals when allowed. One wrote in a private note, never meant for eyes but his own, "He makes the world less bitter." Was it love? Was it friendship? In the medieval world, the line was not so sharp. Male affection was permitted, celebrated even, but only within rigid bounds. If it became too tender, too frequent, too visible, someone would notice. And when they did, separation followed, quietly, carefully. No one spoke of sin, but the message was clear. Too close is too much. Still, some bonds resisted erasure. In a small English parish, two men were buried together beneath a stone, marked with a single phrase, "Together in faith, in life, and after." The church later claimed they were cousins, but the villagers weren't sure. They had seen the way the men walked together, shared their harvest, spoke without words. And when they died, within days of one another. No one dared to split them. Not then, because sometimes, even in a world ruled by silence, love endured. In many monastic and parish records, one finds a peculiar phrase, removed for the peace of the house. It's used sparingly, usually with no explanation. A monk transferred to a distant abbey, a novice reassigned before his vows, a scribe suddenly sent to another parish, though his work had been faultless. The language is neutral, deceptively so. But between the lines, another story flickers. These were not men punished for crime, not heresy, not theft, but for closeness. Too many conversations by candlelight, too many shared prayers, too much laughter in the cloister walk. One case from a German monastery records a brother who was too frequently found in the company of another. No sin is named, no action described, but both men were gone within a month, to different cities, never heard from again. It was exile without accusation, not a trial, not a punishment, just removal, for their safety, for the reputation of the order, to maintain what the record calls the order of things. And yet, even in the midst of such careful distancing, fragments of memory remain. A book of hours annotated by one monk bears a tiny note near the bottom of a psalm. He said this one was his favorite, I remember. Another found in the journal of a young friar reads simply, I forgive them, but I miss the mornings. What happened in those mornings? We'll never know, and perhaps it doesn't matter, because the pain of separation wasn't about the act. It was about the loss of understanding, of safety, of a mirror that reflected not judgment, but kindness. The church never called these relationships evil. They didn't need to. They just erased them, quietly, efficiently. And in doing so, they left behind only echoes. There's a story from the 14th century, barely more than a footnote in a French village register. 2 men, labourers, died within a week of each other. No family was listed, no spouses, just their names. A line, almost too faint to read, notes, they shared a household and a grave. That's all. No judgment, no ceremony, just together. And in that silence, something speaks. Because for every law that forbade, every priest who warned, every record that erased, there were still moments like this. Moments where men chose one another. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for comfort, for understanding, for love perhaps, though they didn't call it that. Sometimes it was just a shared cloak on a cold night, a hand that lingered a second too long, a smile that returned each time the door opened. They didn't write poems, they didn't swear oaths, but they stayed, in life, in memory, and occasionally in burial. When we read history, it's easy to miss these lives. The records weren't made for them. The monuments weren't carved in their names. But still, they were there. Between the battles and the bands. Between the lines of sermons and scribes. In the pauses, the omissions, the things not said. And perhaps, in remembering them now, gently, without judgment, we do what their world could not. We let their story be, quiet, unfinished, and still worth telling. So much of history is noise, trumpets, clashing swords, decrees shouted in courts and crowds, but not tonight. Tonight we walked through the quiet. We saw what men did when no one was watching, not out of deceit, but out of need. The silent tears in chapel shadows, the warming wine passed in secret, the fists raised in grief, the carvings shaped by lonely hands, and the whispers between men that no one dared name. These weren't heroes or villains, just people, trying, in their own quiet ways, to feel something that wouldn't destroy them. And maybe now, centuries later, we can hold space for them, not to excuse, not to judge, just to see them, to let their stories breathe, and then to rest. So if you're still awake, let the weight of the day melt into the hush. Feel the rhythm slow, the breath ease, the quiet settle. Because tonight, even the strongest needed a place to be soft. And now, so do you. Good night.